it gives me great pleasure now to hand over at this point in time to really the CEO of Rastafari RootzFest himself, who's going to convene the next panel, which will deal with some of the issues which we have, but I think specifically Rastafari Strategy for Climate Change. And Ras Iyah V, yes ma'am, please go and do the honors, give thanks.
All right, give thanks again. Before I even go into the meat of the matter, I would like to introduce Professor Charles Nesson from Harvard, who is a Harvard law professor. I would also like to introduce Dr. Kathleen from Calgary University, and Prof. My other indigenous brother. I'm grateful for you to be here. Just want to point out that, Prof, you could come and have a seat here. Dr. Kathleen from Calgary. And what is the other brother name, Prof? You can just...
Hello, how are you? It's Kathleen Mahony is a professor from Calgary University who just recently sponsored a conference in Canada to which Iyah V attended. And indeed, the reason that she's here is to bring to this event the wisdom of Canada in the form of attention to how its indigenous people related to the Canadian government in a way that produced success. And the purpose of Iyah V going to Canada to participate in this conference was to be able to come back here to address the question going forward of Rasta Strategy in the face of resistance from government to asserting itself in a way that takes lesson from Canada, from the Assembly of First Nations in Canada. And so we're putting together a group here to discuss it, which consists of First Man, coming. And the first thing that Kathleen requested by way of engaging in this discussion is that we get out of this panel format and actually come down front and form a circle with the chairs so that we engage in a conversation. Is that something that we'd be willing to do? Iyah V?
Are you ready?
Yes.
You want us to go into a circle at 360 degrees, or let's do it?
Let's do it.
You know, from years upon years, we've always been concerned about the climatic conditions, about the pollution that is taking place, to the point that right now I'm here with First Man. First Man don't have on any shoes, me have on. But guess what? There was a time when we never used to travel in vehicles. We never used to go into a car. We used to walk, journey anywhere we are going. Why? Because we know that all of these manufacturing things, all of these vehicles contribute heavily to pollution. Right now I drive a vehicle, right? I fly in a plane, I will sail on a ship. But it doesn't mean that I am not aware of the pollution that is being put out by industrialization. Where I am aware of the detriment to mankind of pollution. And we talk about, when you talk about the ozone layer, we know that the destruction is taking place because of the amount of pollution that exists in the atmosphere. We are concerned because at the end of the day, the preservation of our environment is very important. For I and I to grow a certain type of herb, we have to grow it in a certain environment. Even for us as a people, we try as much as possible to eat as healthily as possible. But what about when we are trying to eat as healthily as possible, but the atmosphere in which we live is highly polluted? Our food, irrespective of how healthily we eat, will never be able to counteract the type of effect coming from a polluted environment. So even more important than the food that we eat is the environment that we live in. If we don't protect our environment, it means to me we don't have a future. Because industrialization is destroying our people. There's a brother here from a member of the First Nation, and I remember First Man. Yes, we're the grateful Prof if we can have him now, but Rastafari RootzFest, part of the agenda is the concern for the rights of indigenous people. Like Africans, their lands have been robbed, their resources exploited, and their rights violated. So we have always stretched out our hands in unity. And I say in unity because our experiences are very, very similar. We have one common enemy, and that is these people who are bent on industrializing the world. Not that I have anything against certain type of industry, but to go about industrializing the world without taking into consideration the impact and the negative effect it is having upon the environment, then I think that is a very careless approach. Even before we introduce our brother from the First Nation, well, about a year ago, First Man introduced somebody from the Kwamish tribe from Canada, and before that we had somebody again from the next indigenous group. Give thanks today, we have a next brother who belongs to the Native Americans, whether in Canada, whether in the US, whether in North, South, Central America. We know the history of these people who have been colonized, exploited, and we have to be able to work together to create that unity amongst people with similar experience. So even before I introduce this brother, I just want the First Man to just do a presentation in terms of his association, Rastafari Association with indigenous group, and also as to why. Why is it important for us to unite with our brothers and our sisters who might be a different racial group but having similar experiences? Give thanks.
Yeah, blessed love and greetings in the name of Rastafari. Without apology, hailing the Emperor of Ethiopia. We give thanks for this circle. It's very, very important, especially towards the journey of Rastafari. And it's important also because of the issues. You know, it was requested by our dear friend who recognized that in the indigenous world, right, it's a circle throne. And that's how I came into Rastafari. The Nyabingi Center, I don't know, one square one, or ritualistic spaces are all circle, because we see ourselves as having conversations of king, queens, prince and princesses. So this is really the familiar setting of any Rastafari space. You hear me? So in this journey of our indigenous relationships and connection, what qualifies our group, Rastafari Indigenous Village, which members of the group are here, is because we have embarked on an international platform in terms of the Rastafari movement. And once we did that, then we started to get reaching out from other indigenous groups around the world, some who are involved in tourism, and then others who are really just people fighting for their rights. And Canada became very, very important to us, based on the fact that Canada is governed underneath the same jurisdiction. Their Westminster system just the same, Commonwealth country just the same, and as a result of that, it placed an interest into looking at Canada in opposed to America, just based on the fact that those similarities exist. At the root of all of this is the environment. The environment is what our Rastafari community depends on. So in other words, when our government started to discriminate against coconut and say coconut oil bad and all of the coconut tree them start to die out, that's a direct impact on the Rastafari community, because I use coconut to do everything. So in trying to find out how these things affected our community and listening to the indigenous people of the world who are suffering from the same thing, their lands are being taken away, their total culture is eroded by modernization, which is not balanced. I mean, in interacting with these international people who come through the village, some of their questions will be about voodoo, you know. And our interpretation has to be very clear, because in the time when there was no hospital and no formal institution for health, if you were living in those times, you'd have loved the voodoo man. Now, I love the voodoo man then, and I love the voodoo man now. Because when you're traveling on plane and you look down and you see all these lights, the human world is fragile. And if it fall to pieces, who know Jokoto? Who know what to eat? Who know how do you verify the plants that are there to eat if the ship stop come with the goods? That is the role that indigenous people play on this planet in preserving and protecting the things that have been here from such time until now. So the essence of this connection, Rastafari, can get a little bit complicated, especially with Rastafari, because what happened to the Rasta village in particular is that I host indigenous people, and I have been hosted by indigenous people. So when they are here, and I give them the sacred herb, and herb that we grow, and I give them the sacred tobacco. But when I get into their spaces, they have other sacred plants that are being harassed by their government. But yet still there are many Rastafari who would not be open to share these plant medicines, from the ayahuasca to the peyote to the cocoa plant. So we really and truly have to ask ourselves the question, because the environment is not suffering from unity, it is suffering from harmony. When we do not give things their individual respect, each person, each plant, each entity, their individual respect, so we can harmonize with them, what we try to do is unite and make it become what we want, with one voice, when what it needs is to be itself and respected. So that is the journey that I have embarked on, and I hope more words will come out which will make it a little bit more profound. But there's one thing That is the basis of indigenous, is the land. And that is the journey of Rastafari. Christianity has made this world filled with garbage. Because we sing the song, when I used to go to church, this world is not my home, I only passing through. My mother tell me, said, don't plant no fruit tree because Jesus Christ will come before it bear. So if your spirituality is not sustainable towards the earth, then you need indigenous people to ensure that your children can live tomorrow. Blessed love. Rastafari.
Yeah, give thanks for first man presentation. Well, I see that very much the minds are being open to what this session or what this panel discussion is all about. Again, before I go into the brother, because he's our gen at the moment, I'll go ask Dr. Kathleen, who is from the University of Calgary, and I'm going to tell you that being there, the type of respect with which I was treated, I will tell you, it's very seldom that we are treated with that respect within the Rastafari community, and that's now. And we're not joking, because even amongst us, there's so much hate and envy and grudge. We have to love the people when we see them who can respect us as Rastafari. Dr. Kathleen, with them.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very honored to be here. This is an incredible experience.
Microphone really close to the mic.
Okay, it's a huge experience for myself and our group to come and... Oh, okay. I can sit? Okay. All right. So I was just saying it's really an incredible honor for us to be here with you, and we've learned an awful lot just in the very short space of time that we have been here. I guess I don't quite know what to talk about at this stage of the conversation, but just by way of introduction and perhaps to give you a better idea of why a non-Indigenous white person would be invited to your festival to talk about Indigenous persons. As Iyah V just said, he was recently at a conference that I co-chaired in Canada. And the subject of that conference that everybody was asked to address was Indigenous solutions to environmental challenges. The theme being a recognition that Indigenous peoples have a lot to offer, the discussion on climate change and preserving the environment in a sustainable way going forward. And so there was a wide variety of people at the conference with different ideas and positions, ideological, political, religious, about nature and the environment. And I think that conference was considered to be very successful because it was very diverse. The diversity represented many different First Nations in Canada, all of which have different languages and customs and traditions, but they all recognize that one thing that they all share without any shred of a doubt is the air we breathe, the water we drink, the atmosphere in which we live. And so people came together, notwithstanding their very diverse backgrounds and very diverse philosophies and everything else, to talk about this issue within the overall context that Indigenous peoples throughout the world, of which there are 400 million of you, have some very strong attachment to the land. It's certainly true in Canada as it is here. And through that attachment of the land and the spirituality that goes with it, have developed principles, indigenous, we call them indigenous legal principles, indigenous ethical principles, that is very much needed in the world today as we struggle to deal with the problems that climate change and other environmental challenges are posing for us. So that was the idea behind the conference, and the idea for taking it forward, we just didn't want it to be a one-off event, was the idea that perhaps we could join hands with indigenous groups around the world through some mechanism, some platform, which would be a social media platform likely, where indigenous peoples could share their stories, where they could share their frustrations, their legal barriers, their social barriers, and so on, especially when it comes time to deal with the big multinational companies and others coming to exploit the resources on their land without giving them the due respect that they deserve, and the sharing in the wealth that those resources produce, and also the access to labor, to jobs, and to the profitability of the use of these resources. So that was a common thread, and that was the idea that we should go forward with, was to empower indigenous peoples, most of whom tend to live in remote areas where natural resources are found and extracted, and often run roughshod over the interests and rights of indigenous peoples. One other aspect of the conference that was really interesting and important was the recognition that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a very strong, unifying document. Because in that declaration, which, by the way, has been adopted both by Jamaica and by Canada into our domestic law, in Canada we're in that process right now of domesticating the international principles into domestic law. But the UNDRIP, as it's called for short, the UNDRIP has in it the kind of rights that First Man is talking about in IV, the notion of respect, the notion of self-determination, land rights, the giving of a voice through informed consent to development on indigenous lands. All of that is in the UN Declaration, and it applies to indigenous people throughout the world. So how we see that is as a foundation from which many things can spring up to help the existence and the lifestyles and the experience and the cultures and the languages of indigenous people, so they don't disappear, and as unfortunately many have. And so at our conference we had IV there, we had other representation of indigenous peoples from here. We had Kevin was there. There was the Ecuadorian delegation who are suffering in the Amazon basin due to natural resource extraction and massive environmental harm that has never been properly compensated. We had Canadian indigenous people there who had many experiences to talk about, like mercury contamination of their water, deforestation, forest removals, things like that that aren't just happening to Canadian indigenous people or New Zealand or Australian or Papua New Guinea or Ecuador or Jamaica for that matter. And so our vision coming out of that conference 3 weeks ago now is to have a outreach to indigenous peoples all over the world so that they can communicate together and understand what other indigenous groups are dealing with, and hopefully learn from each other strategies and techniques to have their voices heard and to have the powers that be, whether that be the private sector or governments, to respect their views. And now that there's a legal foundation for that in the UNDRIP, that provides, and other international conventions, but this one specifically for Indigenous peoples, will provide hopefully some leverage against those that feel that Indigenous people need not be respected, that will serve as a shield to protect Indigenous peoples going forward. So by the way, I'm not Indigenous. I should have apologized for that right away. But my partner, and this is how I feel somewhat legitimate being here talking about these subjects. My partner is Phil Fontaine, who's a very famous man in Canada, much like IV and First Man, who has led the Indigenous people of Canada as the national chief, so the chief of all the chiefs. And under his leadership, many different and very beneficial changes were made to advance the cause of Indigenous people.
All right, so we give thanks all the time for experience, and then the other speaker, loaded with experience, Professor Charles Nesson is the next person. In meeting Professor Charles Nesson, what we were thinking about, we have so much issues as a community, and they're all legal, they're all issues that really and truly, the litigation, the amount of money it would cost you to go to court and keep a lawyer there for years could be very difficult. But experienced people like Professor Charles Nesson, I remember when he came to the Coral Garden incident, he was really talking about different approaches that we could use. You know, he mentioned one about the popular people that are amongst us, the Usain Bolts and so on. If you get those people, you know, involved in what is going on and allow them to make a statement about it, those things also, government functions when they are embarrassed as well. You know, so we want to just take all the experiences that are around, especially from people who have been doing the work legally and who have been seeing the work being done. Yes, so put your hands together for Professor Charles.
We titled this panel, Rasta Strategy for Climate Change, intentionally including in the idea of climate change, change of mind, change of attitude, and most specifically, an attitude towards litigation. What Kathleen didn't tell you was that she represented all of the nations of the First Assembly in a huge Canadian lawsuit, which wasn't a lawsuit ultimately, it was a settlement in which she remedied, and her husband Phil Fontaine led the political side of this, one of the most extraordinary abusive situations that you could possibly imagine. The nation of Canada was in the practice of removing from all native families their children and taking and forcing them to attend state boarding schools in which they were effectively deculturalized. The idea to eliminate the native culture and integrate. This was a national offense that was ultimately resolved not by a big litigation with a lot of lawyers going to courts for big orders. It was negotiated on what Kathleen articulates as healing principles, an approach which has the audacity of Jamaica in advancing exactly what the wrong is, but has the civility of self-control so that the focus in the strategy is not to force and make enemies. It's rather to heal and to recognize. That's the core of it. Now with that, if I may, I want to pass to Caleb Behn. Caleb Behn.
Caleb.
Tell them who you are.
Masi Cho for having me. Masi Cho to Ras, the first man to Prof, to Harvard University, to Kathleen. My name is Caleb Behn. I'm Metro Dene and Daneza. I come from what the white people call British Columbia, but what I would know as the southern end of Denende, the homeland of the Dene people, on one of the largest rivers in North America, and my mother's people, the Daneza, who are slightly south of them, but we all live where the Rocky Mountains hit the tundra, in the BC Yukon border. I'll begin like this. Like, I was asked to come and offer some thoughts, but the truth is it's hard to learn while talking. So mostly I'm here to listen. But what we bring as a team, I'm a lawyer by training. I specialize in indigenous law, energy law. I fought fracking very actively for many, many years. And I guess there's a couple things I wanted to say. One, I've been thinking deeply about Babylon. I've been learning about I and Babylon is what Kathleen fought in the settlement over the residential schools. Now, my father went to residential school. My father was torn from his family at 5 years old and then subsequently sexually abused for 12 years. And torn from his family, torn from his language, torn from his land. And the abuse that he suffered was then transferred through my family to me, and I too was sexually abused at a young age. And the reason I share this is that Babylon, where I'm from, in the largest oil and gas development regions in the world, because Treaty 8, where I'm from, a number of treaties signed in 1899 with the British Crown, subsequently rolled into Canadian law. Where I'm from, we're the heart of the tar sands. We're the heart of the natural gas fields that feed the tar sands. We are from one beating heart of Babylon. And what Babylon did to my dad is what Babylon does to the land. They would rape a child, they would rape the earth mother, they would desecrate the sacred, they would desecrate the water. And what I'm seeing as I learn here and I visit here is that we fight the same enemy, but we do so in a different way and in a different place. In the 21st century, in the face of climate change, you need to unify. And I don't just mean here, I mean everywhere. And so what I want to show you, thank you, what I want to show you, and I'm just going to ask that you give this back. You're very trustworthy people, I gather, but just saying, this is a status card. It's in this little bag. Also my personal cards are here if you want to contact me. This is one way that the Canadian nation state defines who an Indian is. And my tattoos, everything I wear on my body is expressions of indigenous law, including the giant cut here that's a feather cut into my right arm. And the blood from this feather was used in an ongoing art project. A dozen lawyers and a dozen famous Aboriginal artists across the country of Canada, we worked together, all indigenous, to comment about art and law, indigenous law. But I guess that blood ceremony, you can see on my arm, every moose I kill, I put a cut in. Every caribou I kill, I put a cut in. And the reason I do that is that the way I look at it and the way I was taught and the way the natural world reminds me pursuant to natural laws, that we are in sacred relationship. And when an animal, in its generosity, in the same way the plants are so generous, gives itself to us, I take it upon myself to give a small bit of pain and a small bit of blood back to maintain that relationship. And that's one type of ceremony. This is a Western ceremony of blood. To have this card, both of my parents have to be status Indians. So I'm going to pass this around. If you look on it, what it says is this card is to certify that Caleb Behn, number 543-000-55701, is a status Indian with the meaning of the Indian Act. Now I understand there are proposals to talk about how you would define your membership, how you can unify, what that means. It has huge implications. As you know, Canada has recently legalized ganja. My people across the country are fighting for our rightful place in that industry, but we're fighting, much like the Rasta, from behind. We don't start with $40 billion in the bank. We don't start with jurisdiction despite being there first. We start at the bottom of the barrel. People like Kathleen, people like Prof, have been the allies that stood with us as we fought to regain our rightful place. And I think there's much to be learned from each other. I think there is, do not make the mistakes we made, because this is a global fight, especially in the era of climate change. So you can't afford here to make the mistakes we made there, because a large amount of the carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, at least from Turtle Island, North America, comes from my territory. And because my people lost many battles to stop that development, your people will suffer, because we live in the globally connected commons that is creation. A final point, and this is something we've been talking about, behind this medallion are the 4 sacred medicines from Turtle Island, which are tobacco, sage, sweetgrass, and cedar. Now I think it's interesting that the Rasta people hold a non-human being, a plant, sacred. And my people too, across Turtle Island, have the same thing. We hold not money, not ego. I mean, some of us are quite egotistical and some are quite rich, but generally speaking, there's something deeper when a people, a culture, a way of knowing and being connects to something, whether it's water, earth, the sacred herbs, the sacred ceremonial things that we use. I think that's one of the reasons why, in the same way I heard you say it earlier, that the Rastas like the conscience of Jamaica. Well, in Turtle Island, the indigenous people have been the conscience, and I would say the anti-venom, the vaccine against Babylon and what it does to the heart and the mind. So with that, I'm going to stop talking, and rather I would like to talk with you instead of talking at you. So I close my mouth, open my ears, and I hope to answer any question, as do we all, that can assist you in your struggle, because our struggle is one.
Yes, I. All right, so, I don't know if Behn is still around, but at this particular time, if he is, I would love him to just come forward. If not, I'm going to ask anyone that has a question that they would love to ask, that you can just come to the center and let us share your questions. And the ones here will do their best to answer.
You do have a Harvard law professor sitting right here. There's some good questions you could ask, generally serious. Yes, ma'am. Yes, Jessica.
I don't really have a question. I just have a thank you for the 3 statements we just heard. Professor Kathleen, it's really nice to have you here in Jamaica and to hear about the work you have done and the work that you are doing. The environment and climate change are so important, and the rights of indigenous people, and it's nice to hear your story, ma'am. Professor Nesson, who's been a friend of Jamaica, wow, going back, what, 20 years, sir, since I first met you. Thank you for bringing these great people to Jamaica to share their knowledge and all their connections with us to make the bridge longer, stronger. Thank you very much, sir. And Brother Caleb, our indigenous brother, how nice to meet you. We have heard of you all, and we know of your works, and we know how close we are as brothers and sisters. So I just want to say thank you as Rastafari. Thank you.
Yeah, greetings. I just wanted to know who could give us a good definition of indigenous people. What would make you indigenous?
So I won't use the UN definition, because there is a definition in the United Nations structure, but I can describe in Canada. You have, so this is the strange thing, that the nation state of Canada defines And we push back and say, don't define us, we'll define ourselves. But within the gaze of the white Canadian nation state, there's three groups. You have the First Nations, so that's 1 million people composed of 634 First Nations, and each First Nation, the biggest ones, will be 6,000 to 10,000 people, smallest, like my mother's, 170. Then you have the Inuit in the far north. And the Inuit represent the, Inuit and Nuvialawit, there's different tribes of the northern peoples who lived at the top of what is now Canada. And then you have the Métis. And the Métis are the people who descended from a union between particularly French and Cree, but many different combinations that created their own culture. Each of these three sort of groups has a national organization that is supported indirectly and sometimes directly by the federal government. I work for the largest, which is the Assembly of First Nations, and that represents the 1 million-ish First Nations in Canada. There's another organization that represents the Inuit called the Inuit Taparsit Kitami, and that's the circumpolar kind of group that represents them. And then you have the Métis Nation of Canada. Now, with pardon me, the Métis Nation, I think something like 400,000 or 500,000, maybe more. The Inuit, I'm not sure of, but we're talking well into the 6-7 figures. The most is the Assembly of First Nations. We're the people below, well, the most northern First Nations are on the Arctic Ocean, but mostly down below. And what's interesting is that the Canadian nation state kind of officially recognizes these three superstructures, each of which represents a smaller substructure. And at least in the First Nations context, there's a lower structure, which is the people in each of the 10 regions, provinces, or territories in Canada. Now, my organization, the Assembly of First Nations, I'm not here formally with them, but that's who I work for. The way they work is they have a United Nations-based model where every chief has a vote, and every 3 years they nominate a national chief, and that national chief describes kind of the priorities for the coming year. Our organization just advocates. We don't represent. We're not the rights holders. We're the place to build consensus, but it's on the individual 634 chiefs to come together into various arrangements like Treaty 8 to then push policy directly. But it's really helpful having a national organization. I've met the Prime Minister of Canada twice in the last 2 weeks, and that's useful in a way. But what's interesting to me is that what about all the indigenous people who don't fall in any of these groups? What about the ones who have found it recently? What about the ones who were stolen from their family and raised with the white people? What about the ones who can't fill out the paperwork properly? What about the ones who are white by blood but were raised in the community their whole life? And these are the issues, these are the challenges that come with the question of what is it to be indigenous, right? Is it your connection to land? Is it your connection to blood? Is it your connection to community? And then what really happens is when the money comes and the privilege comes and the rights come, then, like when I went to law school, I didn't want to apply as an Indian because that meant that some people would see me as getting in easier, even though to be Indian you have to suffer 450 years of genocide. So there's kind of some balancing there, but there are real challenges in the question of defining a people in Canada. And maybe, Kathleen, do you want to speak about the international context, or Prof? No, I'm not really. Okay, question. Other questions? Anything at all? Yes, like we're here to serve, for real. Yes.
Almost a choke. Oh, my card's back. Nice.
Okay, just wanted to say thank you very much for coming to speak to us. Me and my partner also came from Canada to come to this event, and so we're really happy to see you all. You're all here representing us from Canada. And then I was also very taken by your story after having learned in the educational system in Canada about what Indigenous peoples go through. And then also, yes, you have three under the Canadian law, 3 classifications of indigenous peoples. But if your mother is not, or if your father is not, then you lose status. So there's that part too. My question comes from a friend of mine just moved recently to Prince Edward County in northern Ontario, and we went over into the reserve and we saw many marijuana shops. Many. Yeah, exactly. That's exactly where we went. And so I was wondering, is that the only place where things like that are happening in Native communities?
Okay. So I'll be quick as I can. So because Canada legalized what particularly Mohawk, or what they call the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Six Nations Confederacy, what some of them did is said, you never had jurisdiction over us. Your laws are yours, but this is ours. And then that's been the basis of resistance for 400 years. Yeah, so, but here's then the next question, which is, okay, if you're going to stand for your own sovereignty and there's a growing massive economy and you put down 117 cannabis dispensaries on what is contested jurisdictions, what happens? So what's happening now in Canada is there's a number of First Nations, very large communities like Tynes-Naga, the Mohawks, and the Bay of Quinte, which is the nation you're talking about, and they are very business oriented, they're very large, 10,000 members, 6,000 people on reserve, the annual budget would be well into the 8 digits. Like, these are very large governments, and so they go and they say, to hell with you, like, come at us, we've got lawyers, we've got scientists, we're ready to go. Other groups will work under a regional organization, like this is happening in Saskatchewan, where they'll have one nation with dispensaries, but all the members of that treaty, and there may be 70, 80 nations, will use that one place as the test zone. And that's where the test case litigation gets built. So I come from a strategic litigation background. I came of age in the law by fighting oil and gas companies. And that's a good education, because you have to get strategic, right? It's your, if you're outgunned, outnumbered, you better be swift and mean and fast and smart. So there's a question now about the ability of the nation state of Canada to clamp down on these potentially sovereign territories. And that's contested, and it will be contested for a long time, because it relates to something bigger than commerce. Right? It relates to, at one facet, religion and our ability to commune with a non-human entity and enter treaty with a plant and say, like, take your contract law somewhere else. I have a contract with this sacred thing, and we will work together in relation to bring life to our people and wealth and prosperity and sustainability. There's another side, though, and that's the weird part, is that some of these nations have a lot of Hell's Angels. Some of them have a lot of organized crime. There's a possibility that very powerful criminal organizations can roll up and essentially overpower a relatively poor government and then use that as a base of operations that's tough to get into legally because of the unique status of First Nations in Canada. So it's not easy, right? It's always going to be more complex than they tell you. Yes, sir.
No.
Okay, sorry. Do you guys want to add to that? Like, I don't want to monopolize it all.
Monopolize.
No, brother. That's what the white man does.
Yeah, put them together for the brother, please. Yeah. It might be surprising that some people might ask, what does this panel and this discussion have to do with being with Rastafari RootzFest or Rastafari I, but I'm very sure, even though I did take a little time, but I'm sure that you all hear and see the similarity, the similar experience that I and as Rastafari, as African people, have, where the Native American Indian, the first people, the First Nation, there's experience very similar to us. Even where their lands are concerned, is very similar to the ganja situation here with I and as Rastafari. Because like the Virgin that point out, it's I and I who are born the persecution, it's I and I who were targeted by the state, where herb is concerned. And now, the fact that it is being legalized, if we don't know what we're doing, it will be taken over by these very rich criminal people who have been responsible for exploiting us, enslaving us, just like what they are trying among these people. So again, if you put your hands together for these people, one love, one heart, one ear. Now the session is not done, right? Because let me tell you, we have one more seminar, and we're going to do it in the circle as quickly as possible before we come out, because there's a reason why this brother is here. Because when I used to burn herb first time, and go a herb camp tonight, so I used to do it, sit down and we burn herb and we pass the cut chip on the right hand side. It's a feel bone, yes, it's a feel bone. But my experience with Prof is very amazing, because Professor Nesson, with Barbara Anna was here. I don't know if she's here, but she can tell you a lot about this man. Yeah, right. This man is a revolutionary in his own way. Being a Harvard law professor is very seldom, and Kathleen, being who she is as a professor in Calgary, is very seldom that we find these people coming among I and I as Rastafari, sitting down in our reasoning like this. So we still have to recognize and respect and appreciate the input and the involvement of these people amongst I and I as Rastafari. So I wasn't here when Prof was talking. I don't know what he said, but I would like to hear him for the next 2 minutes at least. Professor Nesson, Rastafari.
I'm not going to do 2 minutes. I'm just going to make one point. There's been a huge history of, as you taught me, down pressure. I believe that the advent of the net, the digital connection of the world, that makes it possible for indigenous people, just as a matter of theory, to connect, is now right before us. We have it. And if you imagine the accumulated power of the physical environmental movement, that is, protection of the land, and if you couple that with the equally explosive strength at this point of the cannabis movement across the globe, the combination within the structure of environment, of traditional environmental protection and cannabis, change of mind, legalization, at this point I would have to say that the change of mind, which is the most important, is to put any thought that you are losers in back of you. From here on out, you are winners. This is part of a winning change of mind, a way of looking at the world from the viewpoint of the indigenous, not from the point of view of the king and the queen and the capitalists. It's a view of law. And what I'm most excited about with Kathleen is bringing this idea to my home, Harvard Law School, where we train corporate lawyers. We train lawyers as if the law comes from the king and is all about how to run the legal system that extracts from the environment. What Kathleen is suggesting is that there has to be a new way for us as law educators to educate the young people that we introduce into law to seeing law from the indigenous point of view and offering counsel to indigenous to do the growth that is, I believe now, I believe that there is an imperative now in the world. It is no longer possible, if you are a corporate capitalist, to think that things will go well if we just keep exploiting the environment and the people of the environment. It's time, it's a time that's coming that this group, this combination that we're talking about, the amalgamation of a global, indigenous, integrated viewpoint that focuses on the fundamentals that go down so deep that Caleb talks about them as something coming up as the spirit. That focus, with the number of people that can come to it, becomes itself a power, and a power that expresses itself in a way that is capable, I hope and believe, of actually balancing the force on the other side. So thank you very, very much. I have so much, I'm so grateful for the opportunity that I've had. I have to say, coming out of what for me was not a totally satisfactory American civil rights movement, to come here to Jamaica and see this movement embodied, I have to say, very substantially by this man, and by First Man, and by Sister Mitzi, and by Rastafari. It's powerful.
Yes, unfortunately we have to wrap up because we have one more panel and we have the award ceremony. But I would still like Kathleen to, whatever else you would like to say. Kathleen.
Oh, well, thank you, and I'll try to be brief, but an idea occurred to me while the other people were speaking about unity, and I know this was something that a number of people shared with us, is the problem of unity within the community so you can work together and achieve common goals. Well, out of the settlement agreement that Professor Nesson referred to, the legacy of that agreement, which was holistic and it was driven by indigenous legal principles, was something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Because when we interviewed countless hundreds and hundreds of survivors of the Indian residential schools, and we asked them, what do you want to get out of this process? They would say, I want to tell my story, be believed, and I want to heal. That was notwithstanding whether they were horribly sexually, physically, psychologically abused. Those were the priorities that they wanted. So as part of the settlement, we negotiated a Truth and Reconciliation Commission where people could come in a safe place, tell their stories to the commission, which was made up of survivors plus the wife of a survivor of residential schools, and tell their stories. What was so important about that, and why I'm raising it, is when the Truth Commission finished its work, which took 6 years to hear people, they wrote up 95 calls to action. 95 calls to action that addressed everything systemic in Canadian society that subordinates our Indigenous people to less than whole citizens. So the child welfare system, the justice system, the education system, the healthcare system, the churches, the sports community, all of those systems which mold and shape our children and often omit the participation of Indigenous children, all of those systems are now being reviewed and examined and indigenized, which is a new word in Canada, indigenized or indigenization. So my university is becoming indigenized. And that means we look at everything from admissions criteria for students, criteria for scholarships, hiring policies, the overall ethic of the university, curriculum changes, the whole thing. And that's just one example of the systemic change that's starting to come about in Canada, because the Truth Commission revealed these horrible truths that most Canadians that were non-Indigenous really didn't know about. So it caused us to have what I call an existential crisis. We didn't know who we were. Why? Because from the time myself and my parents and their parents were children in Canada, they were taught that Canada is this wonderful, human rights loving, fair and equal society. Well, it wasn't. And we had to confront that truth after the Truth Commission reported. And so Canadians as a whole, by and large, have bought into this process. And it's changing the nature of the country. It's shifting the paradigm from being a white-dominated, white-only thinking, white-only laws, white-only fill-in-the-blank, to a society that is now recognizing we haven't properly included minority groups, but particularly the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So I just wanted to mention that because it was an incredibly impactful event to have the Truth Commission, but even more so now that the 95 calls to action are being implemented, and our Prime Minister Trudeau ran for office on the promise that he would implement the 95 calls to action. So that was a political win, a huge win that we are presently, as I speak, implementing in Canada to make ourselves a better country in the eyes and in the motivations of our Indigenous peoples, because they were the Truth Commission. They designed the mandate. They participated very courageously and told their stories so that the rest of Canadians could understand them and understand ourselves as a result.
Yes, well, like I said, I don't want to move from out of the circle. I want to seal up. But before we seal, I just want to put your hands again together for these people. Yes, is there anything that you have to say? You can say.
I was kind of monopolizing. I just wanted to say that our people across Turtle Island are much like your people, in that we're people with a drum. But our drum is derived from the first drum, which is the mother's heartbeat as you grow. And what I propose is that in time, my people will bring the big drum, the hand drums, the various drums of our various nations. And I would hope that Rastafari would be hosts to our people coming across, our chiefs coming across. And I will commit to you in the sacred circle, having beat the sacred drum, doing my best to help support as many chiefs as possible to come here in a good way as soon as possible, with the drums, with the dancers, with our culture. And I think to take this discussion further and to build upon the good work that the professor does and the Professor Mahony does, I think we need to get your people and your tribes hosting our people and our tribes to talk about what we've learned, what tactics worked, what tactics didn't, where's the opportunity, where's the economy, where's the possibility. And the other final thing I'll say, because I used the drum, is that I think the greatest challenge for all of us in a world dominated by Babylon and technology is how do we keep the spirit in this? That's always been the challenge. When you engage the colonizer, they have no spirit, and you become eventually like them. And that's hurt my people deeply. That's hurt my family deeply. It hurts me deeply. And so I just ask as we reflect, and I hope someday the tribes of Rastafari will invite my national chief and my chiefs here to take time together, but how do we keep the spirit, the drum, those good things, how do we keep that present in this work? So something to end on.
All right. Yeah, well, I really give thanks for this surprise panel presentation to some of us. But the brother is saying that he would like I and I to welcome and to host his chief and his people here with their drums. What do you say? Rastafari every time. Yes. So, the unity is being built. And not like Dr. Kathleen referred to, some of us know the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and we can use that declaration from the UN point of view to deal with even the very issue that affects I and I as Rastafari.